Felipe Cortes. Felipe joins us as an assistant professor in the finance group.
Okay, so I will do my best to convey my work without the PDF. So I decided to talk about one of the most recent works that I have been working on. And it's about these companies that are moving away from the US. So this is what the media calls corporate inversions. So every 2 weeks or so, there is kind of a new company in the media that announced the plan to reincorporate overseas. So for example, the most recent example is Burger King. Burger King last month or so announced the intention to move away from the US by acquiring Tim Horton, moving to Canada, so as to reduce tax. So this has a lot of momentum in the media, and what we do in this paper is to analyze the benefits and the costs. So there are a lot of companies that are doing this, and the main rationale for this is that by moving away from the US and reincorporating somewhere else, these companies are likely to pay a lower tax. So for example, think about moving to Bermuda, to Cayman Island, the corporate tax is 0. So by reducing the corporate tax, these companies are saving they have some tax savings, but the main argument for shareholders, for convincing shareholders, is that by reducing the amount of tax that these companies are paying, companies can use the cash and pay that cash to shareholders. So by paying lower taxes, it's going to be cheaper for the company to give that cash to shareholders. So that's kind of the main idea that that shareholders have in their mind once they decide to move to reincorporate somewhere else. So the question in this paper is, well, is it a win-win situation? Is it that just by reincorporating somewhere else, is there just a benefit? So we start with the anecdotal evidence. So a couple of months ago, Walgreens announced the intention to move to Switzerland. And one of the arguments against the transaction is that some small shareholders were claiming that by moving to Switzerland, the influence of small shareholders was going to be lower. So there is likely to be an impact on the governance of the company. There is going to be likely a reduction in the influence of small shareholders. So this is the anecdotal evidence that motivates this study. So there has to be a cost. So we revisit the cost and benefits of inversions. And what we find is that once these companies move away from the US, there is, as expected, a lower tax rate. So these companies pay on average 7% less tax rate, which makes sense. However, what we find, and this is the first counterintuitive result, is that these companies are holding more cash. It's counterintuitive because the main argument for moving overseas is that the reduction in the tax rate is going to make cheaper for the company to give the cash to shareholders. So what we find is that these companies are holding more cash. Then the question is why? And what we find is that these companies that are moving away are companies that are penalized by the market. By penalize, I mean that the value of cash that these companies are holding, so every book value of cash that these companies have on their books is going to be valued less by the market. And the reason, the main argument behind that is that market anticipates the drop in governance. So once these companies move away from the US, the governance is going to be lower. For example, the influence of shareholders at monitoring the management is going to be lower. Market anticipates that. They put a discount on the value of cash. So what we argue is that once these companies move away from the US, they end up holding more cash. And it's because these companies have a lower access to equity markets. To the extent that market anticipates this effect, they are going to be less likely to give fund to the company. For that reason, companies hold more cash as precautionary savings, and this closes the loop in our paper. So presumably the main benefit is the reduction in tax, but the penalty that the market imposes on these companies forces the company to hold more cash as precautionary savings. Now the question is whether that cost is going to be meaningful to prevent future corporate inversions. The answer is no. We expect more inversions to come. And the reason is quite simple. So think about established companies, blue chip companies. So Burger King. Burger King is a company that if Burger King wants, Burger King can raise a lot of equity a lot of cash in equity markets. So for big companies that move away from the US, that is likely not to be a cost. But for small, relatively small companies, these companies, they face this trade-off of lower tax rate versus less access to equity markets. And this is briefly my research that I have been working on. So I think I remembered most of the presentation, but